Now, last but definitely not least is Dr. Randolph Kent, who's sitting on my far left. Randolph is the director of the Humanitarian Futures Program at King's College in London, and he's working with various multilateral, bilateral, and non-governmental organizations, both at headquarters and in country offices, focusing on enhancing their strategic planning capacities for dealing with long-term humanitarian threats. Randolph has a very long and distinguished career in working with the UN at a number of senior positions, including UN Resident Humanitarian Coordinator for Somalia in 2002, UN Humanitarian Coordinator in Kosovo, 1999, and in various roles, also as Humanitarian Coordinator in Rwanda, and Chief of the UN Emergency Units in Sudan and also in Ethiopia. And currently, Dr. Kent is also a member of the LNAP Steering Committee. He's on the ODI HPG's advisory group. He's also on the Senior Advisory Board for the DFID Humanitarian Emergency Response Review, which was recently published. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Kent to give us his view, focusing on maybe the wider perspective.
Well, thank you very much, and may I start by certainly saying that Richard and my congratulations for what I thought was an extremely interesting report that moves, I think, the process going. And Laurie, if I may just say, now Wendy having shown how old I am, to say how much things have really improved, so well done at the ISC level. That said, let me just take some points, if I may, Wendy, out of the report itself and then perhaps build things on them. One of the things that I think is so fundamentally important that came out of the report is the interrelationship between preparedness and preparedness strategies and the whole response capacity and then, and quite obviously in that context, needs. And I think, if I may just blend the DFID report with the Richard's report, this link between preparedness and needs assessment and response is critical. This is what the British government, or excuse me, this is what the advisory panel to the British government. Interesting how one begins to fall into these things, isn't it? It began, if you like, and is going to try and push forward. So that said, what was interesting, however, from the report is the difficulty of actually trying to get that preparedness into some kind of needs assessment. And that, I think, is something that one will really have to work on. The link between preparedness and needs assessment over time. And this, which I'd like to raise in another context further on, is also why I think we have to start looking in terms of risk mapping and vulnerability assessments with pre-crisis arrangements. We cannot afford, no matter how well-intentioned, to have clusters, coordinating mechanisms, et cetera, flooded with so many well-intentioned agencies. I think this actually gives us an opportunity to say, how and what criteria can we have to try and have the most effective groups that should be doing assessments given a certain range of potential crises. That said, you know, if I may, that in the report there's a very interesting statement, and it said, and I recognize it so well, too many things to too many people. How many things do you have to reconcile as you get a needs assessment? And the reality is really this, but I'm sure it's all changed. The reality is that you, as a coordinator, as the system presently functions, has really no effective mechanism to make decisions other than trading off. You can buy a lot of drinks, you can buy, if you like, and pat people on the back and say very nice things, but when it comes to the ability to make a decision about what needs are there, you do not have the authority. And this is a fundamental problem. So part of the reasons that there are too many things for too many people is this is a trade-off system. This is, if you like, allowing one group to have something to ensure that another group, if you like, will not protest or resist. It's the dilemma of coordination. But, Laurie, I look forward to hearing if that's still the case. I also think, as the report points out, there is a deep lack of clarity on how to analyze. And again, it goes to the fundamental point of who do we actually call relief providers, assessors, etc. And this is a fundamental problem in this business, and particularly when so many outsiders flock into somebody else's country. What are the qualities, what are the expertise that you're taking with you? And the report mentions something called inadequate field skills, and perhaps many of you will recognize this. Perhaps my comment is slightly tired, and maybe we've gone well beyond that. But let me put it in this context. I think there's a paradox to our professionalization, that the more skilled we've become, the greater we are with innovations and new ways of doing things, I think the more we may be losing our ability to engage with the afflicted or the affected. And this goes to a key point which Richard made earlier about what and how do we engage with people either vulnerable in the preparedness sense or affected in the crisis sense. You know, one of the phrases, and I apologize if some of you might have heard this before, but one of the compelling phrases that came out of Hurricane Katrina was somebody who said, you know, the problem is it don't seem like experts like talking to the poor. And in a funny kind of way, this sums up our dilemma. And my question is, in a sense, well, this is an old issue, and how many different versions over the past 3 decades did this issue come up in? But nevertheless, are we even becoming less effective in dealing with the poor and the affected? So a question. And then the other thing that I would like to mention is there's a mention in the report on cell phones and cell phone technology. And I think some of the things that Richard brought out were really fascinating. But are we looking at innovations and innovative practices consistently, effectively? Do we know how to identify, prioritize, and implement new types of innovation that can enhance our needs assessment process? You know, I was at the European Space Agency a couple of weeks ago, and actually listening to how they could begin to identify levels of water that were available to such an extraordinarily small and finite degree. Would that help us? How do we think about these things? What's the process by which we identify them? And then if I also may just move to that, and that is one of the things that's fascinating in our own funny kind of ways as humanitarians is that, in a sense, we sort of know the crises that we're going to face. We know that earthquake-prone and volcano-prone, et cetera, et cetera. And I wonder if that's the world that we're going to be living in as needs assessors in the future. What is Japan telling us? What happens when all of a sudden wide swathes of infrastructure in developed countries and in developing countries begin to start unraveling? What happens when you put that card in the ATM machine, not in New York, but in Nigeria, and it doesn't work because you've had a cybernetic collapse, because whole systems go down? Impossible? Try Mumbai in 2005. That's what happened. So basically, how do we prepare? What kind of skill do you need for that kind of needs assessment? And if you think, well, it's a bit far-fetched, take a look at the kinds of crises we've been having over the past 5 years and answer this question. How will I know what kind of needs to identify in crises for which I have no inkling might occur? Then, if I may, Wendy, just 2 final points. One of the things that came out of the HER process, the DFID, Humanitarian Emergency Response Review process, was a real call, a real determination to try and get governments engaged. This was a fundamental point. And I think to some extent, we as perhaps traditional, certainly as you described me, traditional humanitarian actors, have to start thinking about the world is deeply changing. And if you like, the complexities are increasing. The emphasis now has to be more and more upon governments and how one gets governments engaged and enhance their capacities as, if you like, needs assessors. So I would have liked to have seen more of that in the report, if I may just say. I think one of the fascinating things that came out of this very, very good report was who owns the data. And I think to some extent Richard began to describe this fascinating, how does the data generated, when he looked at Japan and the, if you like, crowdsourcing, et cetera. But I would wonder how we as potential assessors, given the functions that James said assessments have to, if you like, notify the international community, to garner resources, et cetera, when you take that same point about crowdsourcing, crowdfunding, and the whole scope of social networking, how do you deal with what you might call online noise? How do you know what's really true? How do you know how accurate this is? How do you know when somebody's saying, I need help, and how do you really know that it's true? And I think one of the major things that I would love to see the UN do on a very, very important scale would be to see how will we in the future, in needs assessments as well as other aspects of humanitarian crises, actually deal with online noise. Thank you very much, Wendy.
Thank you.